The last speaker for this first panel is again the Reid Basher. Reid Basher is going to talk about the case on the New Zealand from his perspective. His house, he lives in Wellington, I think, and his house may be near the fault line of the earthquake, and it could happen and affect his home. And he happened to be my boss in the UN, where he advised the UN ISDR's Margaret Rostrom as a special advisor. Then my role was to advise him. No, I'm just kidding. He has been into this disaster risk reduction policy making process for. Then, as somebody mentioned already, he was one of the drafter of the last Hyogo framework for action. Some portion he drafted it. So he's been known this area for policy making process in the so Prof is lead.
Well, thank you, Yuichi, and I think he would say all those nice things even if he hadn't been a worker for me, I hope. So it would have been nice to talk about Wellington and its earthquake risks, but I'm actually filling in for another person who does work for the UN, which I don't anymore, and she was unable to come. So I was asked yesterday to provide some insight into the role of science in the United Nations processes. And it's on the basis of, well, how well does this help? How does it reflect the role of academic research in meeting societal needs? So some basic points. The United Nations is not a scientific organization per se. It's a political club of governments. And so it reacts to government interests, and it is primarily this political mechanism. In my view, science is not well represented in its main processes because governments are generally represented by political actors, by those who have expertise in social, political, economic concerns. However, in the specialized agencies, which are those like the World Meteorological Organization, World Health Organization, UNEP, the Environment Program, Food and Agriculture Organization, of course UNESCO, which takes science as one of its concerns. Science is well dealt with. It is a primary concern and foundation and culture of those organizations. So there's this disparate element that the political agenda sometimes responds to science. The scientific organizations do it in key areas. In disaster risk reduction, the current United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Reduction, it's a strategy and it has a secretariat, but the strategy evolved from the International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction. And that did have strong roots, science roots. It was in a way driven by scientific institutions. The Framework Convention on Climate Change is perhaps one of the finest examples of science serving societal needs. The convention expressly identifies its scientific foundations. It relies on this massive research effort that has been operating for decades through the World Climate Research Program and other research efforts. And its assessment through the IPCC process, which largely involves scientists. And of course it requires systematic observations. And this is successful principally because governments require a consistent scientific basis to make joint agreements on how to deal with climate change. They can't just rely on their own scientific institutions because the science is global. But there are other scientific issues that countries grapple with where they can rely solely on their own institutions. They don't have to have agreements about the science. Climate change is not one of them. Science needs international leadership for these reasons. Hazards do not fit within national boundaries. And there are many follow-on effects from major events that span borders. This photo shows two heads of state, Prince William of the Netherlands, now King William, and Prince Naruhito of Japan. Both of these men have been very interested in science in their lives and have driven processes to bring science to bear typically on water, and in the case of Prince William, water and sanitation within the United Nations system. Common standards and terminology are a critical issue too. Let's have a look at some of the examples of where this international cooperation is most effective. The one that I'm most familiar with is the international exchange of global weather data and weather forecast products through the World Meteorological Organization. This is another club. It's the club of the national Met services. And those who are familiar with it will know that it's a highly professional organization, and that the work of it is done primarily by countries, within countries, sharing data, gathering information, making forecasts, communicating that to their governments and to their publics. I've already mentioned the IPCC process. FAO does an excellent job with many partners in assessing food security, food supplies, and therefore risk of famine. And then internationally, cooperation outside the UN, there are many of these, and I just mentioned two, the World Climate Research Programme, but increasingly integrated programs concerned with natural sciences and the social sciences and the integrative sciences like public health and geography, environmental management and so on. And these programs are growing because they actually address real issues of political concern and concern by people around the world. For the disaster risk area, within the UN, in fact, I think Gordon McBean mentioned this, the three major thrusts at the moment in this area: the Tohoku Framework for Action, the follow-up that will be decided here in the next week or so, the Convention on Climate Change, and the Sustainable Development Goals, which are the follow-up from the Millennium Development Goals, which are coming to an end and which have been largely successful. So these things they come down to similar sort of processes, especially for those in poverty and in developing countries. So the science is overlapping, and it doesn't make sense to consider them separately. So in all cases, there is a strong effort by the science community to make sure there is integrated approaches, that the science is dealt with, and that each of these areas is not done in isolation, neglecting or counteracting efforts in the other areas. In the UNISDR system, many science organisations are strong supporters, whole ranges of them, the big international organisations like the World Meteorological Organization, for example, the institutions that are concerned with particular topics, these science platforms such as on landslides and wildland fire. However, in a general sense, my view, and having worked quite hard over about 8-year period to try to build better coordination and leadership on science, it's still not there. There are internal difficulties in how this gets done in the UN, and solutions need to be found to this. There has been some, I believe, increase in awareness, and I think at this World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction, I can see more initiatives, more at the sort of official level by governments and the UN to really grapple with how science is made more real and more supportive of the disaster risk reduction agenda. I have to mention this outstanding success for the Secretariat is the Global Assessment Report process. It's done every 2 years now, and there's I think we're on to the 5th one, which was released a few days ago. It focuses on the economics of disaster risk, and it's a fairly hard-punching publication on the matters of cost of disasters. Where does science need to be going in terms of the HFA process? Well, governments have made some quite good progress, or not just governments, but business and local authorities and so on. But the core concern is still on this issue of underlying causes of risk, because this goes at the heart of who owns the land, who decides where buildings will be built, who controls the financial resources within a country to do things. And often the poor people are left out. Those who pull the levers don't particularly want to be constrained in how they do that. These are areas that are hard to deal with, but if you don't deal with them, you create risk. You expand the risks that you have. And this, in turn, will be the problems we will reap in the future because we continue to build risk rather than shrink it. Science, of course, is directly involved in the climate change area, and developing countries still it's partly because they don't actually have capacities of all sorts, but including scientific capacities. The new framework that will be debated here over the next week, we call it the post-2015 framework. There's a so-called zero draft released in October. Science and data issues seem to be better addressed than in the past, so that's good. Numerical targets are proposed, so that's bringing a hard discipline to waving our hands about reducing risk. How much are we going to reduce it? What are the indicators of that reduction? But this is a tough area, and there are enormous methodological difficulties in setting targets, working towards them, monitoring them, and determining whether policies have been successful. But and then there's this area of weak progress on the core sources of the risk. But where is science in this? Well, I've underlined these or highlighted them in red. You can see there are significant scientific issues as we work towards a more mature, systematic, comprehensive action agenda on disaster risk. One little thing that has, it's not so little, it's a very nice initiative in this region by the UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, an expert group that brings together statisticians and disaster people, puts them together, and with a view to building proper databases on disaster impacts and disaster risk. And this has been led, in fact, from UNISDR. Well, many people, of course, lead good initiatives, but the first meeting was held here last year, and some of these countries, not ones you might expect, some of the smaller developing countries actually are making very good progress on this, whereas in some cases rich countries are really not doing anything at all. I won't name them because some of them are a bit close to my home. So policymakers will pay attention to disaster risk science. It's got to be solid information. Specific cost-benefit information is very important. Countries need a tradition of evidence-based policy making, and the public is right in there behind. If the public's not aware and doesn't understand, policymakers will back off and not take action. But with public awareness, they will move ahead. Key issue is the active engagement of scientific and professional bodies, such as UNISDR, but also other intermediaries, journalists, and even, as I heard from Owate, the disaster risk managers themselves can play an important role in communicating. So I won't talk, Japan has much experience and there's much to be said about the Disaster Countermeasures Act. It's a great success. So in conclusion, I can say that science entities play key roles in the business, in the systematization of disaster risk reduction and standards and training and so on. This post-HFA era of what I call mature DRR will demand more from us. So more is required of us to address the deeper issues which we have not grappled with adequately in the past, but also to implement systematic approaches and methodologies. And to do this, we just have to strengthen our partnerships with all aspects of society, all levels. And we have seen at this meeting many nice examples of where scientists have really got out there and talked to cities and communities and policymakers. With that, I've finished. Thank you very much.